And we aim to build a knowledge sharing hub of Asia expertise and inspire new ideas and solutions to policy and business challenges. So today is our third event. In our first two events, we talk about digital innovation in the pandemic time. We zoom in to India and then talk about the digital health care innovation. And this time we move to the topic about gender, peace, and security in the Asia Pacific region. It's super happy to have Alex here from UN Women to share with us today. And it's going to be quite simple for the format today. We're going to have Alex talk to us about the research project for about 20 minutes, and then afterwards we're going for questions. As we've already got many questions from the audiences. And then a little bit background about why we're here talking about this. Like the gender topic, I believe everybody agrees that it's a trending topic. However, women, peace, and security agenda in the online setting format, it's still emerging. It's a very emergent topic, and then it's quite multidisciplinary. It's emerging in the sense, like, for example, the questions we received could go at, we received from the audiences could go as broad as what's the matter, what's the issue, and why does it matter? It could also go very specific to like conflicts regarding conflicts or post-conflict inclusion in cybersecurity policymaking. So without further ado, a little bit introduction about our speaker here today. We have Alex from UN Women. She's program analyst with the Governance, Peace and Security Unit, UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Alex has several years of experience working on issues related to international migration, peace building, and preventing violence, and a lot more broader topics. And then her background, she has a bachelor degree in politics and economy and a master's degree in international development and management. Currently, Alex is working on the regional project that specifically addresses gender dynamic of online harms, threats, and cyber-enabled crimes. And she explores challenges and opportunities that online platforms, AI, and other forms of technologies that may carry for peace and conflict dynamics in the region. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alex and then introduce the topic that she's working on.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that excellent presentation. And thank you so much to Hertie Network, Hertie Asia Network and the Hertie School of Governance for inviting us to share a bit about our work. Just to give you some brief background, UN Women Asia Pacific Office have been working on the topic of women, peace, and cybersecurity. So the intersection between the women, peace, and security agenda and cybersecurity for the last 1.5 years. So we started working on this early 2021. So today, I just want to share with you some of our initial insights into some research that we've been working on. So primarily focusing on the relevance of cybersecurity to the women, peace, and security agenda. But then I will also deep dive a bit into some gender and security aspects to AI and some important considerations for us going ahead. So I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So to set the scene for today's presentation, I would just like to provide you with a brief background to the topic and our work. For years, much of the evidence base on the intersection of gender and cybersecurity has come from the human rights community. And this means that research has primarily focused on cybersecurity in relation to interpersonal online gender-based violence and gender inequality within the ICT sector. However, the issue is that these topics are often siloed from topics of international security and peace building. So this is something that we wanted to explore a bit further. We can see that recently this research focus and the programmatic focus on the topic is shifting, and we do see an increasing number of initiatives, including research and policy efforts aiming to understand and respond to gender dynamics of harms and conflict drivers in cyberspace and the misuse of information and communication technologies, or ICTs. And in parallel, the topic is also gaining more attention in both international fora and in regional organizations. So for example, what we have seen in Southeast Asia, which is the geographic focus of our program right now, is the importance of recognizing cybersecurity consideration in the realm of peace building and security, which has been acknowledged across the Association of Southeast Asian Nations as a key priority issue in implementing the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the region. So they're currently developing a regional plan of action on women, peace and security. And in the preparatory work for this, cybersecurity has been highlighted as a key issue. While the topic is gaining attention as a priority topic for peace efforts globally and regionally, significant research gaps on cybersecurity implications for the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda still persist, specifically in the Asia-Pacific region. So as of last year, UN Women embarked to contribute to filling some of these research gaps. So for the last year, we have conducted research on priority security, cybersecurity implications for the implementation of the WPS agenda. And this is research that will soon be finalized and published. We're just amidst the copy editing of this. So in the coming months, we hope to publish this. So it's going to be available for you. We will also start conducting research on gender peace and security implications on the development and application of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And we have also in the pipeline to commission research on the specific cybersecurity needs faced by women-led CSOs and women human rights defenders in the region. Next slide, please. So as I briefly mentioned, in today's presentation, I will share with you an overview of some of the main research findings on our research on women, peace, and cybersecurity, outlining why cybersecurity is important for the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, building on cybersecurity priorities that have been highlighted by women's civil society in Southeast Asia as key priority issues. I will then delve a bit deeper into the outcomes of the preparatory work that we have been doing for the research that we're planning to conduct on gender, peace, and AI. So firstly, we, as I mentioned, we're in the process of finalizing our research report on women, peace, and cybersecurity. And this study is exploring internet user experiences in Southeast Asia with a focus on cyber threats from a gender lens. And it covers users' experiences from 10 ASEAN countries. The methodology that was used for this study involved key informant interviews and focus group discussions with, for example, politicians, activists, human rights defenders, digital rights organizations, civil society organizations, businesswomen, and so forth. And it covered a total of 84 informants. So I will now begin with providing you a brief overview of the key research findings, outlining the relevance of cybersecurity in the implementation of WPS commitments. Next slide, please. Okay, as I'm sure that you're all aware, online spaces are critical for acquiring knowledge, establishing social connections, and for engaging in advocacy and movement building, and even more so following the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw rapid digitization of all public fields. Increased digitization has not only resulted in increased opportunities for civic engagement online, but it has also been used as a tool for radicalization and digitized warfare with attacks on critical infrastructure, which is why cybersecurity has emerged as an important consideration for the international security field. Women, Peace and Security, as I'm sure that you're also all aware, is a policy framework that recognizes that women must be critical actors in all efforts to achieve sustainable international peace and security. And this also includes digital spaces. Nevertheless, we have seen in our research and across many other studies that men are more likely to have internet access than women. And such digital divides are more pronounced in the global south compared to the global north. The digital transformation triggered by COVID-19 pandemic in Southeast Asia boosted the internet use in the region and gave rise to opportunities for business and civic engagement alike. However, safe and equal access continues to be a challenge in the region, and gender-responsive policies are lagging behind. We can see that women are systematically underrepresented across cyber-related fields and professions, including in decision and policymaking position, security experts across STEM and technology workforce, in cybercrime investigation and prosecution efforts, and so forth. There are various barriers restricting women's access to the digital space, as listed on the slide here. It's, among other things, includes control over economic resources, social class, age, geographical location, ethnicity, and religion. And these are some of the factors that are contributing to access inequality across genders and marginalized groups. Next slide, please. In terms of harms commonly faced by women peacebuilders and activists in particular, our research found that the issues listed on the screen were the most pressing to our target group. It's important to mention that this list is not necessarily exhaustive, but it represents some of the key issues faced by women in Southeast Asia as per our study. We mainly identified threats across the three following categories, which is harmful acts, harmful content and messaging, and cyber-enabled crime. So in terms of harmful acts, we saw that cyberbullying and trolling were recurring issues faced by our respondents. Cyberbullying is an aggressive and intentional act carried out by a group or individual using electronic forms of contact repeatedly and over time against a victim who cannot easily defend him or herself. And this is a serious concern, particularly for young women and men who tend to be more active on digital platforms. Trolling, which is the practice of behaving in a deceptive, destructive, or disruptive manner in a social setting on the internet with no apparent instrumental purpose, was also shared by many respondents as a key online harm. Key informant interviews found that many prominent women activists, journalists, and human rights defenders face trolling on a regular basis, and that this is constituting an obstacle for them to continue their work in peace activism, ultimately impeding civic engagement and peace building online. In terms of harmful content, we saw that issues such as doxing, hate speech, and the spread of different types of false information also were pressing concerns. Doxing is the act of publishing private or identifying information, such as personal addresses or phone numbers about an individual online without their consent. So in several cases, we have seen that women's phone numbers have been leaked on Facebook, for example, leading to attacks via messages. But in some cases, this has also led to offline violence and stalking. When it comes to LGBTQIA+ activists, this act was often combined with act of outing, which includes revealing personal information, often on a person's sexuality, against a person's will. So in some countries where diverging from the heterosexual norm is stigmatized or even illegal, this can be of great danger for the individual. The use of hate speech to drive conflict and push extremist narratives is also another key harm. Hate speech and information may also drive radicalization and spread extremist ideologies on social media by fueling resentment towards certain groups and individuals. And disinformation has targeted women holding public positions with the aim to discredit them or prevent them from exercising their functions. Conflict and post-conflict contexts offer fertile breeding grounds for disinformation and propaganda to spread. So for example, what we could see in Myanmar a few years back is that disinformation spread on the Rohingya population online contributed to exacerbating the violence against them. And this led to an increased suffering among the women Rohingya population, as well as men, and increased incidences of sexual violence and gender-based violence. And finally, the third set of issues that we found related to cyber-enabled crimes. I can go back to the, yes, thank you. So for instance, we have seen that high-ranking politicians, journalists, human rights defenders, and activists face a higher risk of being exposed to data breaches and hacking, and they risk having personal information leaked. We also know that transnational criminal networks use digital platforms to deceive persons and draw them into exploitative and often degrading situations, often under the pretext of promised work opportunities. So they act as a conduit for cyber-facilitated trafficking. And all of these harms, they're not only detrimental to the well-being and mental health of the individuals who are targeted, but the systematic targeting of women on online platforms can and in many cases has resulted in self-censorship, where the targets of these harms may withdraw from peace building, civic engagement, and activism engagement. Some online harms can also have impact on the target's personal lives and security, as harassment and stalking online carries the risk of transferring to offline spaces. Next slide, please. So while we will provide more detailed recommendations in the upcoming report, we can broadly say that in order to prevent and counter online harms and security threats with attention to gender, government efforts need to be invested in adopting gender-responsive policies, including the implementation and enforcement of policies and laws. UN Women has conducted a mapping of cybersecurity laws and policies in the region, which found that no country in Southeast Asia has any explicit gender provisions in their cybersecurity frameworks, which is making it very difficult to prosecute the harms that I have mentioned. Many of the threats discussed in the report also unfold or are facilitated by digital platforms, especially social media platforms. And while the platforms have community guidelines and policies, the responses to harms have remained insufficient, according to the focus group. Civil society and digital rights groups are also important actors in providing technical solutions to provide women activists with services, such as providing free virtual private networks and other services for journalists and civil society organizations. However, it is important to note that the sole responsibility of enabling women's active participation in digital platforms cannot only be placed on CSOs, as governments and digital companies carry the main duty-bearer role in terms of ensuring safe digital engagement for all. Next slide, please. So in short, the regional research that we conducted to date has focused on the experienced harms and threats that women peace builders, activists, and civil society representatives face in Southeast Asia. However, it's also important to understand how the design and function of digital platforms and technologies themselves interact with these harms and threats. So throughout the initial research process that we have just gone through, technological vulnerabilities, including data breaches, machine learning, and AI, were highlighted as key issues for continued work on gender-responsive cybersecurity. So in response to this call, we have developed an action brief building on a literature review on available research on the interlinkage between gender, peace, and AI. And this document has laid the groundwork for the design of more substantive research, which we will initiate in the coming months. So I will just provide you a brief overview of the main takeaways from this literature review as well. Next slide, please. So while AI is often highlighted as a groundbreaking innovation, it carries many risks, particularly relating to gender, as AI-powered systems have been found to discriminate women and people of color. Many studies agree that biases across AI systems are a result of existing and historical inequalities where women, people of color, and minorities have been underrepresented, discriminated, and stereotyped against. And AI technologies may in fact contribute to enhancing these inequalities. For instance, we have seen that women, and particularly women of color, make up the groups that are the most misclassified by facial recognition systems, while white men are the least misclassified group. Widely used voice recognition software is 70% more likely to recognize a man's voice compared to a woman's. Women's work applications are less likely to be considered in automated recruitment selection processes. And women tend to be disadvantaged in automated criminal justice risk assessments, as the risk of women reoffending tends to be overpredicted by the algorithms. So these biases can be explained by the lack of disaggregated data and historical patterns of underrepresentation and invisibilization of women and people of color in tech and across other industries and public spaces. And these have seeped into the codes and algorithms that shape AI technologies. Bias issues can also be explained by unequal access to the internet, where women and persons from the global south, particularly in Asia Pacific and sub-Saharan Africa, where women are less likely to engage with online platforms and therefore leave less data points online, resulting in machine learning programs having access to less information on these individuals and groups. So these issues connect to the point that I raised earlier on the digital gap and women's underrepresentation in the field, and highlight that it's important not only to increase internet access and leadership and meaningful participation of women in overarching decision-making professions, but it's also important to make sure that women take an active role in shaping technical and specialized fields relating to AI. Next slide, please. So AI is not only integral to individuals' internet usage, but it's also increasingly used for surveillance, intelligence operations, and military technologies. However, military AI technologies are highly contentious, and although research is scarce, there is research indicating that these technologies also include gender bias. For example, with regards to lethal autonomous weapons, which have been found to be more likely or carry higher risk of misclassifying civilian men as combatants compared to women. Outside the scope of strictly military technologies, we have also seen that AI has the potential to disrupt social cohesion and to incite conflict and violence. Among other things, they're contributing to digital echo chambers where hateful and radical narratives can flourish and be left unchallenged. For example, we have seen that echo chambers have been identified as one of the key drivers in the emergence of incel culture, which has provoked violent hate crimes, including mass murder and sexual violence against women. Automated content spread by bots is used to spread disinformation and computational propaganda more rapidly. And deepfakes or manipulated video and audio content have been used to target women, including human rights defenders and journalists, through, for example, pornographic content, where the target's participation has been faked by programming the visual image of their face onto another video. And this has been used as a means to harass, discredit, and silence these individuals. It's also worth mentioning that social media companies and digital rights actors are also developing AI-powered tools to counter some of these issues by, for example, automatically flagging, taking down, and hindering the publication of potentially harmful content. However, automized content filters have been criticized for not adequately meeting the needs of women and girls, as they're not accessible or fast enough, nor are they advanced enough to account for contextual differences on what types of content are considered harmful or not. Next slide, please. So while these findings are painting quite a bleak picture of AI, there are also opportunities to use these technologies to facilitate and strengthen peace-building efforts. Although gender biases in these technologies hinder equal online engagement, digital facilitated peace-building has been identified as a venue for increased opportunities for women peace-builders to advance their work. So researchers from the Stockholm Peace Institute have outlined 4 main areas where AI technologies can be particularly interesting to incorporate in peace-building efforts. And these include using big data mining and automated analysis of geographical information and social media narratives to enhance conflict analysis efforts by bringing support to or uncovering unknown trends and correlations. As automatization allows analysis of real-time developments and online narratives and trending content, these can be employed and used as early warning systems to indicate a heightened risk of imminent violence and conflict. Automated analysis can also uncover trends in violent narratives, how they're used, and in which fora they're being spread. And this information can inform a more efficient and timely counter-narrative campaigns and strategies. And lastly, social media platforms offer important spaces for women peace builders to engage in peaceful protests, advocacy, and other forms of civic engagement. So novel initiatives show how AI-powered technologies, such as chatbots, are able to provide on-demand judicial support to activists, as they've been used in, for example, Yemen and Libya to facilitate peace-building dialogues with a broader group of stakeholders. Next slide, please. So based on this initial review of the existing literature on the topic, we compiled 5 overarching recommendations, which are the ones that you see on the screen. So we have to gather more evidence and data and research on the implications of AI to support the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda across the Asia-Pacific region, but also globally, to ensure that we're making evidence-based decisions and policy priorities as we develop programs to support women's digital peace building and online civic engagement. We must also support women's leadership and participation in the development and audit of AI and ICTs for peace and social cohesion, including policies, laws, and other decision-making processes, to ensure that women's perspectives are taken into account and to counter bias and inaccuracy issues in technologies and digital platforms. We should also advocate for the integration of a rights-based lifecycle approach in the design of AI technologies that recognizes the diversity of contexts in which they function. They should have a clear predefined intent and scope of functionality, and whose design is gender responsive and transparent to the user. We also have to support women peace builders' enhancement of their conflict analysis, mediation efforts, and advocacy through digital means and online platforms by designing initiatives and programs informed by the local needs of women peace builders and activists in order to ensure that they benefit from all the opportunities and potentials that digital platforms may carry. And finally, we must also increase the digital literacy among the general public and experts alike on ICT and AI, with a specific focus on conflict contexts, including the security implications of gender and racial biases, and the threat of disinformation, to provoke critical thinking and enhanced understanding of the complexity of our interactions online. However, these findings are very interesting and have been important for us in guiding our research, but more deep-seated knowledge is needed on the gender dynamics of the usage of AI. So building on the findings that I have presented today, we're currently recruiting a think tank to work with us to develop more extensive research. So we're hoping to finalize this research next year. And as I mentioned in the beginning, in the coming few months, we will also publish the overarching report on women, peace, and cybersecurity. So if you found this presentation interesting, I would highly like to encourage you to follow our work, and please stay tuned. And I look forward to answering some of your very interesting questions that you have provided today. So thank you so much for attending and for giving me this time to present some of our work.
Thank you so much for the very informative presentation. To me, at least, it's a very engaging learning process, I would say. Like, I never imagined how broad the topic could be, and it's definitely multidisciplinary by its nature. So we talked briefly about the big project that feel a bit closer to online harm prevention and protection, and to mention an ongoing gender and AI project that's more on the interlink application gaps and opportunities. With that, I'm going to use the privilege of the host. I have two questions for you first from me, and then we'll open the floor to audiences. So audiences, welcome to just chip in, open your mic, or feel free to type your questions in the chat box, whatever you like. So the two questions from me first, a little bit of backstage story, like why you and women decided to start this project, what triggers it, and yeah, what's the major aim purposes?
Yes, okay, so that's an excellent question. And I think that it's something, so it's a very emerging issue. And I think especially in light of the COVID pandemic, where we, society went through such a substantive transformation where we had to move more public services online, and we were more dependent on digital platforms. I think this really shed light on the increased vulnerability of people online, especially women and girls who face the disproportionate brunt of the risk of online harms. So this was something that we identified, but also not only in terms of online gender-based violence, but we also saw it in terms of radicalization, for example. So we had a program on preventing violent extremism, where we, during the COVID-19 pandemic, started looking at the narratives that were spread on online platforms. And there we could see that online platforms, in fact, fill a very important function in facilitating conflict and disrupting social cohesion in society. So I think that's where we started exploring this issue. But then it's also been increasingly in the global limelight, especially also on the higher UN levels. So in 2018, I think, the General Assembly mandated the establishment of an open-ended working group on ICT and in the context of international security. So it's definitely been a topic that's been more and more prioritized also on the higher level UN platforms. So I think, yeah, both looking at global priorities and looking at the needs raised, not only from policy priorities, but also from research, but then also looking closer at some of our local findings from some of our work that initiated this process.
Very interesting to understand that. The second question is very interesting. So the question asked, it started from a comment that there have been campaigns to get more women into cybersecurity. And then asked, do you think progress has been made in this regard? From your point of view, what is hindering more women from going into the field, if that's the case? And then it ended up asking, how did you get started?
That's a very interesting question. So I think it's important to continue pushing for these campaigns to highlight the need of women's participation and leadership in cybersecurity policy. Because as I outlined in my presentation, we can still see that it is an issue that we don't have enough women in these fields. We don't have enough women in policy making and decision making positions. So I think that we really need to continue normalizing women's leadership in these fora. And I think that this is also important, an important part of challenging more traditional view, where I think that technology and cybersecurity has been seen as a traditionally masculine field. So how do we how do we go beyond that and outline or really highlight the need and interest for women to engage in these fields? I would also like to say that the issue is on I think the issue is on one hand, traditional gender norms, which poses a challenge. But it is also an access issue. So I think we also need to make sure that women have the same degree of access to internet and technology as men. And this can be done through many different ways, but I think it's also important that we ensure that we, in parallel with trying to increase access, also focus on enhancing digital literacy, for example, to ensure that women and girls can engage with digital platforms in a meaningful and safe way to avoid some of these harms that I touched upon. In terms of numbers, I think it's difficult to tell because we still don't really have stable data on women's participation. So I know there are a few different studies. I think there was one study in 2017 or 2018 that indicated that women's workforce in cybersecurity was less than 10%. However, in 2019, there was another report on women in cybersecurity by ISC squared, and they concluded that 24% of the cybersecurity workforce in the region were women. So if there has been an increase, maybe, but it's difficult to say because these studies have been based on quite different methodologies. So I think it's difficult to say, but I think it's definitely a more discussed topic. And we have a lot of great initiatives led by women as well. So I think it's all about continuing to advocate for this. And how I got into it myself, I think, I mainly got into it from a peace and security angle because that is my background. And I wasn't really aware of these interlinkages when I started. So I think it's really been a learning process, getting into this thematic. But I think that's something that we see across. So when we talk with digital rights organizations and civil societies in Southeast Asia under a project, for example, we see that there's usually a huge gap between the digital rights organizations that are experts in cybersecurity in the very technical aspects. And then we have organizations that are experts in gender equality and women's rights. But the challenge here is to make sure that there is an equal learning back and forth between these two groups to make sure that both expertises can be joined and leveraged together. So I hope that answered your question.
Interesting. And then we've got multiple questions from the audiences in the chat box. If you don't mind, maybe I just read it out, or maybe actually we welcome the audiences to open mic if you want to ask the question yourself. If not, then the first question is, could you share why there is focus on Southeast Asia as opposed to South Asia or particular countries? For example, is that because of more conflict or violence in the region?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think our long-term ambition is definitely to work in the entire Asia-Pacific region. And this is something that we're working towards. Right now, in light of funding spaces and feasibility of conducting the study, we had to limit it to a smaller geographical area. And here we started in Southeast Asia. Also, because there is a big political momentum in Southeast Asia right now, considering the development or the pending development of the Regional Plan of Action for Women, Peace and Security by ASEAN. So we saw that there was a momentum and an interest in the region simply to work with these issues. So that's why we chose that as a starting point. But ideally, we will also expand this later to South Asia as well and to Asia Pacific, because I think these regions, of course, all face different cybersecurity challenges. And I think that they are also quite different in nature. Especially if you look at the Pacific Islands, internet connectivity is much lower. So that would have different implications for the cybersecurity considerations that would have to be prioritized in that region per se. So it's a real good question. I hope that we can expand the project to cover the entire region, but for now, it is Southeast Asia.
Perfect. And then there is another question asked, could you please expand a little on how digital literacy was measured over the course of the preliminary study that you described in the beginning of the presentation? Also, you mentioned gender responsive policies as required intervention. So are there any structures which already currently exist as best practices in the private or in the public sector?
Okay, great question. So digital literacy is something that we've been working on a programmatic level, but that has not been the primary focus of the study. In terms of the interviews, we asked the respondents what the main obstacles to women's participation online was. And some of them mentioned the gap between the increase in digitization and the fact that digital literacy is lagging behind. So when we refer to digital literacy, this is based on the perceptions of the respondents themselves. In terms of digital literacy, we have been working on that in Vietnam and the Philippines under the project as well, where we have been focusing on the digital literacy of youth. So here we have developed, it's still in its pilot phase, but we have developed an online learning module where we're compiling some of the findings that we have from research and other studies on best practices in terms of cybersecurity under different thematic priorities. So we have a module on misinformation and how to stay safe from online gender-based violence and many other topics as well. So this is a module that was employed in the Philippines and Vietnam. And after that, during those activities, we did a pre and post survey where we found that the participants' self-assessed knowledge and the digital literacy had increased. And this was also later taken in, so building on the lessons learned, they received mentoring in gender responsive cybersecurity, where they got to develop their own projects to outline what they learned and to disseminate that to their peers. And then the second part of the question, gender responsive policies as a required interventions, are there any structures that are currently exist with best practices? So in terms of Southeast Asia, there is a lot of work done by digital rights organizations and civil society that are putting forward their own recommendations on what they see as the best ways forward to enhance gender-responsive cybersecurity in the region. However, a formal structure and document is currently not in place, but that is something that we're working to develop. So in June, early June this year, we invited a women's representative from civil society organizations in the region to develop, to co-develop an advocacy brief together with us, where they outline priority actions for policy reform in the region. So that's also something that we're hoping to finalize soon as well, just as a guidance for policymakers in the region and for them to have a compiled source of some of the priorities that civil society organizations in the region have stressed. Thank you so much for the question. I'm just looking through the chat and there's a lot of good questions.
Yeah,
here.
it's a quite comprehensive question.
Yeah.
And there's another quite comprehensive one. So the question talk about things implementing effective cybersecurity measures that prevents discrimination of women requires a multi-stakeholder approach. So how can countries work towards eliminating the dichotomy between cybersecurity and women's rights, and especially in regions where there is like widely spread discrimination against women? What can be done to decrease the laxity in such scenarios?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, and I think it really comes down to a core issue that is quite challenging in working with these issues, because it's really about striking the balance between, or rather emphasizing and really highlighting the relevance and importance of ensuring that women's rights are protected in these aspects. And I think that one important debate that we usually touch upon in this is for states to strike a balance between maintaining cybersecurity practices without bordering into the realm of surveillance and restricting human rights. So I think that can be a challenging debate to have. So I think the key here, I think there's not really an overarching answer that will apply to every country. But I think it's about identifying where states themselves find that there is an added value to engage in these topics. So for example, we had one civil society organization sharing an example with us, and they worked in Singapore. And there they said that they had been struggling to convey the importance of ensuring gender-responsive cybersecurity practices. But then they spun the narrative and they said that, okay, but Singapore is priding itself on having a very high degree of security for women in offline spaces. So then they designed advocacy lines around the assumption that, okay, but we have a very safe and secure society for women offline, but how about online spaces? And that's how they managed to find a hook to continue building on this, and that was successful for them. So I think it's really about understanding the local context, the political context, and the policy field in the country where you want to introduce these policies and thoughts. Yeah. I think that would be the short answer to a very interesting question.
As a follow-up, I know it's a bit tricky to ask, but I really wonder kind of how do you see the issues or the status quo in Asia Pacific part of the world through a Nordic lens, like you're originating from Sweden. So how different it is, or yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. I would almost say that there's a bigger or greater awareness the debate is much more present, I would say, in Asia Pacific, or has been up until last year, I think, because that was the first time, I think, the beginning of last year, where I started hearing about these debates in Sweden domestically as well. But I think that's really a sign of the fact that these issues are very global, and also amid the security situation we have globally now, with last year's events, both in Asia Pacific, but also in Europe. I think we're entering a very different situation compared to the last decades in terms of security considerations. And it's something that all governments and states are realizing the importance of. But I would also say that now is really the time to emphasize the gender angle of these issues, because commonly when we talk about cybersecurity, it gets stuck in quite a macro level international security lens, where the gender perspective is often left behind, and where we don't really see the human security aspect of it as well, where we see, we have these issues, we have these security issues and challenges, but how are they affecting individuals that are using technologies, and how are they affecting the social dynamics of societies?
Interesting. And I see we have a raised hand here. So it's Akia from CGAP. Can you unmute yourself and then jump in? Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Kate. Thanks, Alex, for the detailed presentation before the report is out in the public. Hello from India. I'm Akhil. I'm the co-founder of a think tank called Center for Gender and Politics. We work on amplifying women's political leadership across South Asia. And therefore, I am particularly interested in one of your recommendations where you said, where you talked about improving or supporting women's leadership and participation in developing ICT for peace building and policy making. I wanted to understand from you, where does the women's representation in the APAC region stands right now? And what are some immediate steps governments can initiate towards improving women's representation?
Great, thank you, Akhil. That's really excellent question. I think in terms of where women stand, as I mentioned before, it's a bit difficult to get reliable data, especially on the whether participation has increased or not. I think globally, I'm not sure for Asia Pacific, but globally, we see that developers of AI technologies are 78% men. I am not sure if we have data on Asia Pacific region on that, but that would definitely be interesting to look into. But we do see a general underrepresentation of women. So in terms of policy making, I think one important recommendation that was brought forward by civil society groups that we met with was to ensure that cybersecurity considerations are to a greater degree included into university curricula, and that we have programs or more programs touching upon these issues, also from a gender lens. And that we discuss these issues from a gender perspective to a greater extent. There are a few other recommendations as well, which we will present in the report. But I think if I remember correctly, a few of the overarching policy recommendations, some of the key takeaways was that cybersecurity regulations and policies must be harmonized with the gender and human rights commitments and women, peace and security commitments to ensure that they all function in parallel. So we don't have any contradictions in the policies. And this also includes technological development, and for countries who have AI regulations as well, to make sure that these issues are reflected. This should also include survivor-led policies and legislation on digital security to ensure that we don't have a very victim-centered narrative going forward, but that we also need to give women agency and recognize women agency in these processes. We also have to undertake cross-department and ministry-level efforts to build closer working relationships with those mandated to address cybercrime and cybersecurity and AI developments. And we need to make sure that these connect with those mandated to address gender-based violence and other family protection issues, because usually what we see is that when someone has, for example, been exposed to an online harm, it's very difficult to find the right reporting mechanism to go to. And oftentimes law enforcement are not really or don't really have the routines either to adequately address these issues. Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. So sensitizing law enforcement and judicial systems on gender equality and cybersecurity and AI as well, and making sure that these agencies also have adequate knowledge about these technologies and the harms that they can cause is also an important piece of this. So these are just a few of the takeaways that I can remember on the top of my head. So I hope that's helpful and that it covers at least a part of your question. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question. Thank you, Alex. I think given the time, probably we're going to have likely 2 more questions and then we have to close the floor. So actually we have friends from different universities, different institutions here today. And the question is apparently asking by a student. So the student is wondering, as a PhD student, who do research about gender equality, leadership and business, and then asking about if there's any opportunity or maybe how to do kind of participatory internship or research assistant job in organization like UN Women.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, I mean, it is quite a new novel topic, or well, the topic per se is not novel, but it's making the interlinkage between gender, peace, and cybersecurity, where more research is very much needed. But there are a lot of think tanks working on this, for example. So there's a think tank called ICT for Peace, which has been doing a lot of thought pieces on this. So if you're interested in reading more, I would definitely advise you to look a bit closer at that. In terms of universities and specific programs, I'm afraid that I don't really have the best overview. So if anyone of the participants know and have some recommendations, maybe they can post them in the chat. I've seen that Leiden University, for example, they have some, they have a research project ongoing, I think, on the role of China in AI development as well, but I'm not sure if it's also touching upon gender issues. We have been working with Monash University on preventing violent extremism, and they have also been conducting some pieces of work on the spread of misogyny and violent extremism on online platforms. So we have a publication on that as well that I can post to you in the chat if you want to. But yeah, I think the list can be made very, very long. And I think, you can find a lot of different organizations and also UN entities that are working on these issues. For example, UN Women is exploring gender and cybersecurity, but UNESCO has also been working quite extensively on that. UNDIR also have a publication on disarmament and women, peace and security. So that could also be an interesting organization to look a bit closer at. I think the United Nations Training Institute also have some modules on women's participation in cybersecurity policy. So yeah, exactly. So I think that I can compile, I have a few links to some of our own publications on the topic that I can share in the chat, including the research from Monash University, and maybe I can also have a think on other resources that could be interesting to share.
Cool. And the last one. So as a person who worked in the field for quite a long time and as one of the major researchers of this project, what is the single most important thing that you want the audience to take away from today's content?
Oh, that's such a big question. I feel like we could keep talking for hours about this. Yeah. No, but I think just maybe more critically reflecting on the, first of all, how you yourself use digital platforms and the messages that you see online, and try to think about this also in a broader perspective to see which power social media carries in terms of shaping narratives. And I mean, for the last couple of years, we've been talking a lot about fake news, but what do we do to, verify information? What can we do? How can we contribute to ensuring that the online space is more safe and secure for everyone? How do we call out harmful behavior? And how do we make sure that we don't contribute to any harmful activities online? I think that's the key thing. And I think that this thinking can span from everything from your own personal interactions online to thinking about what you're seeing in media, or how people are discussing political or sensitive topics as well, to just induce some more critical thinking, and to remember that there are quite strong interlinkages between the gender dynamics and security and cybersecurity aspects that we're all being faced with.
Thank you so much. I can resonate so much from that, and it's indeed cybersecurity that affects everyone. And let's hope that we can incorporate all those things we learn from the traditional peace and security process, and then incorporate that for the benefit of a more sustainable, open, and stable digital world. Let's hope. And then let's see what's going to happen. With that, I'm going to conclude today's session. Thank you so much again, Alex, for time sharing, and thank all the audiences to stay with us. I would encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn, Hertie Asian Network, and looking forward to see you in our next event. So with that, bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you for listening in and for providing us with this space. It's been great.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.